Joint study sessions with the Planning Commission. And so, Mark, do you have all your commissioners here tonight?
No, we do not. Craig is not here, and David is not here. Jason has to work. Okay, so this is great.
Okay.
It was on the planning board for like 2 years.
I said commission.
Yeah,
Now you've had to say, now you've had to say board.
It's always been commission until you changed it, I think, before. And we changed the language, I think.
I don't think this is on the agenda, but thanks for sharing.
I'm just pointing that out, I'm just pointing it out.
Thank you for protecting our
Really. So, who wants to start this off?
I think we're just gonna turn right over to Kathleen.
Good evening, members of council and planning commission. Again, Kathleen Osher, serving as the project manager for Mission Littleton. So as we had shared with you the last time that we were together, tonight's focus is really on the fiscal impact analysis, as well as the implementation chapter of the transportation master plan. We've reached both of these because there has been a lot of discussion around the goals and policies for both of the draft plans here with you. And so based on that, these are two critical inputs that we have to look at. So I'm joined tonight by Julie Herlins from Tischler Weiss and Keith Borsheim, which is a familiar face to you. Gary Mitchell unfortunately couldn't travel with some personal things that he had, so wasn't able to make this trip, but we are joined by Meredith Dang from Candid Keys Collaborative, as well as Emily Oliver, Senior Analyst with Tischler Weiss. So as there are questions, if we need those two additional resources, we may call on you, so be on ready 5. So we're gonna dig in this evening first with the fiscal impact analysis and then take a look at that implementation chapter with Keith. So I'm gonna turn it over and let's get started.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. Good evening, members of the council and planning commission. It's good to be here with you this evening. I'm gonna drive and you're gonna be looking over my head. So we're here to talk about the fiscal impact analysis, preliminary draft results from our analysis. We will talk a little bit about introductory comments and sort of what a fiscal impact analysis is and what it's not. Then talk through what we've modeled in terms of alternative growth scenarios that tie back obviously into the comp plan. Talk a little bit about our methodology to do the fiscal impact analysis, and then get into findings and the discussion of those findings. So first, by way of introduction, just to provide a little context for our line of work. So I'm a vice president at Tischler Weiss. We do a lot of work in fast-growing communities in the Intermountain West, in Colorado, Arizona, Western states, also on the East Coast as well. We're based on the East Coast with offices also in Idaho. But we really, we're planners, but we specialize in that connection between land use decisions and fiscal impacts. What does it mean to a locality to provide services, infrastructure? How do those land use decisions, those kinds of changes, things that are happening in the built environment, what does that do in terms of services and infrastructure and those needs? And so we've highlighted here what we're doing here for you today is fiscal impact analysis. We also do a lot of impact fee work because a lot of times what comes out of these discussions is, well, there's a shortfall. I'm not looking at Keith or anything, but but that there's a shortfall, and then what do you do to maybe plug that gap? And so impact fee is obviously a common tool, particularly in Colorado, where you're heavily dependent on a few sources of revenue, so there are these other sources of revenue to explore. So I wanted to talk a little bit first about how we define, how we talk about fiscal impact analysis, what that is and what it's not. And so when we talk about fiscal analysis and what we've done for this study to date is really what we call the cash flow to the public sector. This is direct revenues to the city. The city is the jurisdiction that we're looking at. The school district's not included, the county's not included. It's only those revenues that come back through to the city. So if there's county revenues that come back to the city, those are included. But it's just what's generated within the city from changes in land use, from the development. And then the other part of the equation is what are the costs? What are the costs to serve that same development? And when we talk about costs, we're talking about operating and capital costs, really to serve that growth, to serve development. And then at the end of the day, are there sufficient revenues to cover those costs? We want to capture all of those revenues and costs that are affected by growth, by changes in development patterns, by anything that really happens on the ground that's going to affect the city's cash flow, essentially, the revenues and the costs that are impacted. And this is really very different. This is really two very key important points. And the first is that it's different from an economic impact analysis. A lot of times, you might have a developer that comes before you or some other entity that says, you know, this project's going to create all of this revenue in the community. And it may very well be, but that's income. That could be income that has no relation to the city's budgetary situation. You don't get a local income tax. So those jobs are created here. There's disposable income that's created that may actually, that may get spent in those retail establishments, but it's not a direct fiscal impact. So the economic impact is really talking about the wealth in the community. There's a construction phase that occurs where there's, you get construction use tax. Yes, that's a direct fiscal, but there's other things that are happening, jobs that are created as part of a construction phase. Those folks may or may not live here. They may be coming in from elsewhere, and so that, again, may or may not have an effect on the direct fiscal impact. It also doesn't follow jurisdictional lines, is what is the other point too, in terms of those jobs could be created on the other side of the city, and you're the conduit from one side to the other. And so regionally, it's maybe an economic impact and a positive economic impact to changes in land use, but that's a different number. And typically, those economic impact analyses are only positive numbers. There's no costs associated with it. It's just the benefit. All very important. We do those analyses too. They're very important to know and understand, but you have to understand what the questions that you're asking and what kind of results, what kind of analyses, what kind of studies you're talking about. And then it's also different from a market analysis, where that's looking at what's the demand for a certain type of product. Is there demand for new retail space? Is there demand for office space? What can be done to sort of push that, to force the market, if you will? It also talks about, it also gets into absorption, how quickly would those types of products get built, get leased up, those kinds of things. That's not what we're doing for this analysis. It's purely direct revenues and costs back to the city from those changes in land use that maybe are driven by the market, but we're not getting into the market at this point. It's also very different from budgeting. I understand there was some discussion over the weekend on municipal budgets, on your budget. So this is very different. You have, a municipal budget is revenue constrained. You have an amount of revenue, and you're gonna fit your costs into that revenue that's available to you. We're projecting, in this case, revenues on one track, costs on another, and then looking at the end, do they meet up? Is one higher than the other? If not, then what? And our guidelines here are really to forecast based on or project based on current levels of service. What are you providing today in the city? What does that look like, that same level of service and services and capital infrastructure and costs to changes, to new development in the city? So our approach here is outlined on the flow chart, but really it's, our ultimate goal is to compare some changes, but we are modeling, so there are specific inputs. There's real numbers actual numbers, very specific numbers that we're putting into a model to get also very specific numbers on the outputs. But we really want to be able to compare changes in land use, those changes in land use. So we had first defined the land use scenarios. We worked with Ken Keast, took a trend scenario and then alternatives off of that scenario. Then we look at demographic factors, namely how different types of land use drive demand off for services and those kinds of things. So for residential development, it's household size. How many people are, on average in the city living in those types of units that are going to be built. On the non-residential side, how many jobs are created, so we talk about jobs created off of that non-residential land use, and then also types of trips, what kind of vehicle trips are generated that are driving some of those costs. Then, as part of the model construction, look at cost and revenue factors. Again, using your current budget, current state of affairs, current levels of service, and then supplement that with interviews with city staff to understand how growth affects those services, what kind of capacity is available today to accommodate new growth, where are those triggers to meet, where you need to add staff, add police officers, those kinds of things. And then we design a fiscal model, project demand from those land use scenarios, and then calculate the results. Very simple. Okay, so the specifics. So again, we're talking about, we use very, very specific numbers, not rounded numbers. So what we're looking at here is our set of assumptions for the scenarios. The first column of numbers is what's in the ground today. So it's just our set of assumptions today about how many people, how many housing units, what kind of non-residential square footage, and this is from real local data. And then the three scenarios. The scenario one is really identifying or analyzing a trend development that provides for housing in different types, and is really the midpoint of the projections of the regional projections. So it's that sort of that middle area, and then the non-residential development also, again, in terms of trends. And so you're looking at, I just want to point out sort of the units. The unit of measure. So housing units, population, and you're looking at square footage in the middle chunk, and then the job numbers at the bottom. We've also included percentage growth over the base year, and this is a 20-year projection. So if you want to get to an average annual, you can divide by 20 and kind of get that sense about 1 to 2%. So then the scenario two, the alternative off of scenario one, is less residential and more non-residential. And scenario three is even is the same residential as scenario two, and an additional sort of about half, again, more of non-residential development. And so the sort of the guidelines here to develop these scenarios is that, as we well know, Littleton is largely built out, and that new development will occur on the remaining vacant acres, and then the assumption here, intensification and densification of existing sites. I mentioned we start with current levels of service, and so again, using actual data, real data, the fiscal year 2019 budget is used, so we want to use the latest adopted budget, and again, current levels of service, and that's using that current budget. We some other key assumptions. All of the figures that we use and that you'll see, we don't assume inflation over time, and so the question may be, well, why is that? Like, how can you? Because we know costs are going to increase. We know house values will appreciate. So because each of those factors will increase or appreciate at different rates, we want to keep everything in constant, the same level as a snapshot, so that we don't have to unwind all of those assumptions at the end of the day, at the end of the 20-year period, and say, well, we've assumed health, benefits are going to increase by 15%, and and this is going to increase by, and so by the end of it, it sort of loses its value to understand what that means. We're also not adjusting the tax rate, which will happen on a municipal, potentially not with Tabor, but we've assumed a property, stable property tax rate. So the other key assumption on our modeling approach, and this is getting a little bit into the weeds in terms of fiscal modeling, but we've used what we call a hybrid average cost, marginal cost approach. So the marginal aspect is, I was mentioning before about existing capacity in certain facilities or staff, and so by using a marginal cost, we're looking at what can we fill up, in terms of space, where do you have existing capacity before before growth then triggers a need for a new facility. So that's really that sort of lumpier kind of marginal. You get to a certain point, it trips a threshold, and the model, we build another facility, the cost gets incurred. The average cost is really looking at sort of day-to-day operations on sort of operating costs that are projected more on an average cost. If we did everything on an average basis, it would be very smooth. We wouldn't take into account those differences, those nuances with existing capacity, et cetera. I take questions while
Yeah.
Okay.
If you're looking at service level costs, you have to assume some level of cost increase for raises and so forth. So I know you're assuming no inflation, but I don't think that's not a valid assumption when it comes to pay rates.
We're also not assuming, and it's a valid assumption, because on a budgeting basis, those will be appreciating year over year, for sure. But we're also not adjusting any of our revenue assumptions either on the other side. So it would be unbalanced to only, appreciate one side without the assumption on the other side. And so to avoid the challenge and the again, the getting to the end point of having to explain away all of the different elements that have been appreciated. So we're not appreciating, none of the costs or the revenues are appreciated, because you will get increase in values, you will have increase in sales, from inflation from retail goods will
Right.
increase in price at the same time that, cost of living, everything could increase commensurately, or they could not.
Right.
Again, we're not doing a financial model, we're not doing you're not doing a projected budget model. If we were to do that, we would do that for sure, and your finance department likely will do that.
Are you also assuming, you're saying it's a 20-year model, so I guess I'm assuming you guys are running everything out evenly, so each year looks the same. Growth issues or project, you're not doing lumpiness when it comes to economic cycles or anything like that at an assumption level.
Right, what is lumpy are capital facilities where they get tripped, the threshold gets tripped to build those facilities. What isn't, we don't assume a recession occurring, we don't assume, like you're saying, like any kind of economic, anything with an economic cycle over the 20 years, yeah. Which again, and we purposely call them projections and not forecasts, because we're not making an economic forecast for the city. This is strictly to compare, the impacts of land use changes, given what we know today about what the conditions of the city of Littleton, versus, today versus what that would look like if all things, comparing those scenarios to one another.
So
is really
said
good.
another way, essentially, if all things remain the same, what you're trying to narrow it to is just the impact of a land use change.
Correct, thank you. That was better articulated than I.
It's just my simplification
Yes,
in my
no, that's exactly right, on the transportation, we have coordinated with HDR in terms of transportation capital costs and included those and on our modeling side, which is a typical approach that we would take when there's a transportation firm on a team, to take those modeled costs, when we have assumed, and you'll hear more about this in the second part of the presentation, but we've assumed a local share of 25%. That may or may not, these are again preliminary results, there's some activity happening there that may or may not hold at the 25%, but we're gonna be in the ballpark in terms of the local share of those capital costs. And then one other assumption in terms of our modeling effort is that we've assumed those capital costs are funded on a pay-go basis, meaning that when they are triggered, it's one lump sum of a facility. So, $2 million that occurs, in year 7 or what have you. We have the capability, and we could, debt finance those expenses, which would smooth them out. So you'd have the first hit, and then it would smooth out over time. Interest would be included as well. Again, maybe more reflective of a financial policy. But at the same time, if, say, for instance, a capital facility gets triggered in year 20, you're only seeing that first year, and there are growth-related costs that then occur in year 21, 22, et cetera. So the pay-go is gonna wrap all of those costs that are triggered by development encapsulated in those 20 years. So we're getting all of those costs included. So we just jump right into it. Here are the results. What you're looking at here, 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, left side, scenario 2, scenario 3. And this is 20 years of cumulative impacts. So first bar, I guess you can see is sort of the bright blue, revenues. The next bar is expenditures, and then the net fiscal impact. So from that first scenario, which is that trend scenario I showed before in terms of residential, non-residential levels, over the 20-year period generates a net deficit, and that's again a cumulative number, $77 million over 20 years. So again, if you want to get to the annual average, 5 by 20. The next scenario with more non-residential, less residential, more non-residential, generates a net, a positive, a fiscal surplus, a surplus of $28 million over the 20 years, so about $1 million a year, a little more, 1.8. And then the third, more non-residential, more non-residential, I'm saying those words this time like the same, more non-residential, the same residential scenario 2 generates the $85 million worth of, on the positive side. Again, all operating and capital are included. And just to kind of give a sense of comparison, in scenario 2, it's about $1.14 in revenue for every dollar in expenditure, so about 14% surplus. Scenario 3 is $1.33, so a little doubling, that 33% of a surplus there. On an annual basis, let me tell you what you're looking at. Scenario 1 is the dark blue, scenario 2 is the bright blue, scenario 3 is that the greenish color. So as you would expect, from the cumulative results, we have net deficits in year over year. What you're looking at here is revenues generated in each year minus expenditures in that year. We don't carry those revenues forward in each year, so it's just revenues, development happens, revenues generated, expenditures are generated, is it positive or negative? And so that gets charted there. And you can see we talked about that lumpy nature, so those sort of jagged lines are reflective of the capital facilities essentially that are getting built, so we get if it's positive, it's less positive. If it's a negative, it's more negative. And that, as again, scenario 3 generating positive, the most fiscally positive results of the 3 scenarios. So what does that tell us? What do we find out? So in the short term, so in that first few years, all the scenarios result in annual deficits. And this is really because of the capital and infrastructure costs. And again, this pay-go assumption, if we had debt financed those improvements, the results would look a lot different, but again, some of those costs would be pushed past the year 20. So for scenario 1, with that more residential development, there's a greater demand of services and infrastructure, there's less revenue, and a net deficit is created. So property taxes here, a small percentage of the overall budget, they don't generate significant enough revenue to offset those costs, especially with the reduced property tax rate. And then scenario 3, as we said, has the greatest positive fiscal impact, more commercial development and more sales tax revenue, and as I'm sure you're all aware, very sales tax dependent. So as we were kind of thinking about the results and some of the implications, I mentioned that the analysis includes both operating and capital impacts. And to the extent that there's other revenue sources, I mentioned impact fees, there are other revenue sources to offset some of those capital impacts that would change those results. And what will be in the final report, and we'll sort of drill down into these results, is that for each of the scenarios, when you're looking at capital revenues compared to capital expenditures, there's a net deficit in each of those scenarios. But in scenarios 2 and 3, there's enough other revenue to offset those deficits. Sort of general fund revenues that can then be used for capital expenditures. So, and we've often found with lots of jurisdictions that a capital deficit is sort of easier to solve for than an operating deficit, given that there are sort of other tools, other ways to address that. So just one item there. We mentioned the debt versus pay-go. That would change the look of the results. Wouldn't necessarily change the finding of the differences between the scenarios, but it would change the way that those results look, and it also would add in the interest costs as well. Note up here impact fee sizing. The current schedule in the city today is the same rate by type of housing unit and the same rate for non-residential. Those can be more proportional and potentially higher, but more proportional for sure, and vary them by type of land use that's sort of more reflective of the demand for infrastructure off of those land uses, so they can be sort of sized to the need. I mentioned the analysis is based on current levels of service. To the extent there are surpluses or revenues available, one thing potentially to discuss is an improvement of those levels of service. What does that mean in terms of sort of mitigating some of those things that today may be seen as inadequate. Maybe there's an opportunity to test what that would mean from a fiscal standpoint in terms of an improved level of service. Like all of Colorado municipalities, sales tax is king, and so lots of discussion internally about changing retail landscape. What does that mean? What's the opportunity? What are those kinds of opportunities you have here with a small amount of vacant land, but some potential redevelopment in the future? How do you capitalize on that to really get the best return on investment? Using fiscal impact analysis to continue to analyze those opportunities, and to really make use of potential additional future retail and mixed-use type opportunities to drive that revenue element higher. The other piece too is the market feasibility aspect of it. We've modeled 2 scenarios 2 and 3, that assume a significant amount of additional non-residential square footage, and that kind of goes back into the sales and use tax piece. Is there a market? What does the market really look like? Is there a market for it? Is there a need for economic development incentives and other intervention strategies to push the market, to drive the market, to then again capitalize or to augment your sales, your sales tax line item in your budget. And with that, I'm happy to take questions, have discussion. I appreciate your time.
Great. I have a quick question on level of service. That's kind of a new concept that we're beginning to adopt and learn from Keith.
He's not here.
Again, I gave him a shout out. So is level of service an input or is it an output?
So when we talk about level of service, it's a lot different than the transportation level of service, but similar. For us, it's a level of service is sort of that grading, on transportation facilities A, B, C, D, et cetera, so that, in terms of level of congestion and, for us, it's a similar kind of, it's not really a grading, but it's really getting down to a factor of what does it cost per capita, per job.
You assume a level of service which triggers what cost you're calculating in.
Correct. And our assumption on the current levels of service is what the budget is funding today. That's your current level of service. And if there's an interest in a higher level of service, a desired level of service, then that's a different number, a different dollar amount that would change off of that. Yeah.
And I think there's a greater relationship level of service relative to your priority-based budgeting type conversations, right, that you start to see. So if you maintain that level of programming.
Comment and a question. First, this is only just the economics, it doesn't take anything else into account like environmental impact or traffic flow, quality of life, things like that, right? Am I to assume that?
Correct.
Okay.
This is one component of a larger
Right.
menu of items to consider within the comp plan, yeah.
With the different non-residential growths, probably refer to Jennifer back there, give her a second to. How realistic are those numbers given our current situation? You know, looking at the scenario 2, looks like 3 million square feet of new building. Would that be about, I mean, by quick calculations, like, would that be 300 acres of development? I mean, it depends on how dense it is, but are these numbers realistic for?
How many Home Depots?
Yeah.
I mean, I can say on the current 33-acre site, and I think proposing 54,000. 3 million's
It's a big number.
quite a
Yes.
bit.
It's like a Home Depot is what?
I was just going on like 10,000 an acre.
You know, a mall up the street is 1,300,000 square feet.
Streets
Southwest
of
Plaza.
Southland.
Southwest Plaza,
Southwest.
the largest mall.
You see how big it is?
It's 1.3.
million.
So that's 1.3.
Give you an idea.
Southwest Plazas.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, I guess that's 2 stories.
Are these assumptions for scenario 1, 2, 3, especially the non-res, are those, they're not projections, excuse me, estimates based on historic growth or because, you know, just tacking on the same conversation, the concerns about will retail really grow like that with online sales and all that now taking such a big part of the market, and so I'm just wondering how you.
Right. The scenario 1 does reflect a trend scenario, which will take into consideration historical plus the regional, what your share of the regional market would be. And then the adjustment off of that was to test additional non-residential square footage. And so the point about the market feasibility piece is key here, because that does bring into that should occur as part of, you know, implementation activity in terms of what kind of market, what kind of retail, and the big boxes are few and far, that malls, those kinds of traditional malls, you know, it is a changing landscape, but there is a market for experiential retail with, you know, it does come down to, you know, residential with office, with retail, restaurants, you know, again, more the experiential, but it may, in terms of the market piece, require incentivization to push the market in a place that maybe it hadn't been before. But it's certainly happening in the region, it's happening elsewhere in places that have, my example from earlier today was just some places that have been relatively conservative in terms of using Virginia, for instance, you know, for using public interventions, doing those kinds of things and sort of pushing the market in a way to create those kinds of spaces that then drives the retail and then in turn drives the sales tax revenue.
Do we have a estimate of what our current, I guess it says right there, never mind, current retail and everything is, so, I mean, if we went up that, we either have to add all that new or convert some of that existing that's underperforming, would that would account for that too?
Yeah, I mean, that would.
So the new growth doesn't have to be brand new development, but it could be redevelopment of existing underperforming sites.
And I think the important connection is back to the comprehensive plan, so maybe you can shed some light on how, you know, Tischler Weiss being the sub-consultant to Candid Keys, they kind of took their lead from the work that we've done and thought through the comprehensive plan.
So one thing we did.
We just have one more question.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, I was gonna maybe go where I think you might be going, but the land use map is aspirational and what, connect the dots for me just to make sure I understand, are the representations of the economic results from your modeling efforts reflective of what we've identified on the map? Go ahead, that's where I'm going.
Yes, so we looked at the 210 acres that's currently vacant, and in scenarios 2 and 3, it assumes that 80% of that non-residential would occur on those vacant areas, and 20% would be intensification or redevelopment of existing non-residential. And then in scenario 2, it looks at having a FAR, floor area ratio, that's similar to what an average across the city is today. So we looked at a bunch of different non-residential sites, and we calculated an average current existing FAR of 0.345, and in scenario 2, it keeps that pretty much the same, 0.33. So that's looking at, that takes into account the question of multiple stories. So floor area ratio is basically looking at your lot coverage, taking into account the height, so your total gross floor area. And then in scenario 3, that assumes that some sites would become much more dense. So those would have an FAR not all the way up to 1, but some of those could be much larger, whether it's transit-oriented development or some other sort of heavier intensification scenario. So, like that.
That makes sense. Maybe you stay.
Let's talk about people. You probably have reams of information about why people cost the city money. Could you describe that a little bit more? I mean, I see people, more tax revenue, they eat out, they dine, they shop, you got some income. What are the main drags of people moving to a town like Littleton?
Right, right.
That brings it below that level.
Right. Police services.
Right.
That's, a big ticket. Well, and the fire is separate now with the separate districts, so it's not,
we'll
but
pay.
normally yes, but not here. Police and transportation costs, there's additional trips on the roads, so that drives maintenance costs, for, wear and tear on infrastructure within the city, so that's calculated in as well. Any kind of, the parks and recreation programs, so there's program costs, whatever's included in your general fund from the parks and programming side. The library, that's general fund, so any of the services that are provided, so a lot of those are, and again, we've sort of a combination of an average cost, so not every cost is assumed to increase with growth because there's some capacity in staff, like, you have a department director, you're not gonna hire another department director, but there's some staff levels within a department that are gonna be affected, and so as more folks come, those costs, those positions get higher, correct, yeah.
Well, is it a science, or it sounds like a little bit of an estimate here, you're kind of averaging things out.
It's an art and a science.
I'd say a little more of the art, but there's got to be other numbers.
It's a science and an art,
Yeah.
sorry, science comes first.
But what are sort of the breaks? Because I mean, you don't need an incremental police officer for 10 additional residents. I mean, where do you assume?
It's what's in the ground today, so so if there's 60 officers today.
40,000 people.
Right, then that, and we do model calls for service, so basically we have calls for service data, and we tie that back to land use, and so it is triggered, it's not just it's not a officer per 1,000 that we use, and some analyses will use that factor, and they'll say we gotta have 2 officers per 1,000.
Okay.
Ours is calls for service, this is what's happening today on the ground, there's some that are from residential, some from non-residential, et cetera, et cetera.
And I think why it's so important that all of the information coming from our departments, as well as being at a unique point in putting together the transportation master plan for that number to be much more fine-tuned than I think we would have had we not been underway. And both of these came at a point in time where we actually had a number to plug in. And we always knew this timing was gonna be really tight, but that was always our hope, is that you could plug something real in. But all of that data coming directly from us.
A quick question. Were you
And this may even be for Meredith. So were you surprised on the bar chart of the substantial disparity between the net fiscal impact? I mean, to have a $77 million deficit and then the 28 million in terms of the net fiscal impact, it seems that the other bars were not moving in as radical and extreme as that. So I don't know what is contributing to that.
Yeah, really on the first scenario, it really comes down to sales tax, really, sales tax revenue, that there's less, so if we look back to, so we had an increase, a net increase in scenario one of 1 million square feet of retail versus 1.8 versus almost 3 million. So that's a big driver. I mean, there are costs associated with non-residential too, don't get me wrong, it's not all revenue, there are significant public safety costs that are generated off of retail in particular. So there are costs associated with that, but with, if you just model the residential, but that's and just the capital, still needing capital expenditures to support residential and the non-residential growth that's included in here, and not enough revenues to cover those costs. So, yeah.
Because again, here you're just, from a modeling perspective on revenues, you're just taking into account sales and use tax, you're not taking into account property tax.
No, we are, it's in
You are,
there as well,
property
right,
tax here
right.
as well. And the property tax on commercial is gonna be higher than the property tax on residential.
Well, the taxable value off of it, yes, so there is that shift between residential and non-residential. But it is, in the grand scheme of things, it's less proportionally from than sales tax. It's just, that's just,
Other questions? Kyle?
Did you consider running different scenarios that had, that matched more aligned with the comp plan with population increases, like, even more, residential or even less residential than that?
So the population that's in scenario one is the midpoint projection that's included in the comprehensive plan. So we did not talk about having it go higher than that because there hasn't been a huge appetite for additional growth beyond that midpoint number. Scenarios 2 and 3 do have a lower residential number, so they're about half as much residential as in scenario 1. So we kept the midpoint as the high.
Okay, I mean, my question with that was not to say there was appetite, but just to kind of show the effects.
It would be a bigger deficit.
right, and you can sort of extrapolate off of it.
How big did you say the malls are again?
About 1.172.
Home Depot.
So when you change those, over 20 years, those numbers are all based on 20 years, of course. So, and with that in mind, so what is the probability of this being accurate? Have you done probability analysis?
It's not meant to be a forecast. It's not meant to be a forecast of the development projection, then the amount of development. I mean, the trend scenario is if all things continue, the best of, and it was from Dr. Cog, is it Dr. Cog, regional projection essentially? At least a combination.
Yeah, I had 4 different, and then that number was the midpoint.
Right, so this is the region's best, the various sources' best guess of the demand for housing, demand for non-residential in the city. If that were to come true and every, again, we're not forecasting a expenditure plan for the city. We're trying to compare if you were to change the base assumptions for, what land use is in the city, what that would look like, revenues to expenditures.
Yeah, this is just based on status quo, basically.
Status quo of levels of service, correct. So no change in policy, no change in levels of service, no increase in, again, like an office, if you had an office for 1,000 kind of criteria, again.
Yeah, and I like that approach, why you did it that way.
So it is more overarching, but I think it will flow well into the fiscal sustainability tool that the economic development team will be working on with EPS, which we'll be able to get into more project-specific development by development. And they're gonna be coordinating the assumptions and inputs for those.
Yeah, I think two things. One is that the market is king. The market makes the decisions, the market rules. I mean, and the market right now is pushing residential, they're pushing municipalities to build residential to the point where it's become painful, even for those that were eagerly building them, 5 years ago. It's painful. And the type of residential that are having to be built because of ridiculous laws in Colorado are making it even more painful. So the market is pushing that. We have very little control over that type of thing. The market is also pushing people away from retail. They're pushing people to the internet, that people are moving away from exactly what you think we should be doing. The market is not agreeing that is what it wants to do. And so I'm interested most of all in watching how this matches up to this comp plan that we put together, which is our 20-year vision, which can help us direct and vision but we don't manage the market. I get it, you can do some things to incent, you can do this, that. We have been trying to get people down here to build one of those cute little markets for 15 years. We've been trying to get people to come down here and put a stupid Sprouts in Littleton for 15 years. The region, I mean, we need to look at this regionally too. We've got Trader Joe's and Sprouts all around us. And I'm just using that as an example. But that is why we don't have one. Because they don't see boundaries, they don't see borders. They see rooftops, so when we're looking at the things we need to do, we really are not just looking at our isolated little Littleton, even though that's all we have any authority in. So I'm really anxious to see how we loop this back into the comp plan, how we create some scenarios where council and planning can make some decisions, can lay some things out that can help us to and it is it's a turning of a freighter, right? It will be a slow process, but even like a 5-year, what can happen? Because I think right now the forces that are at play in preventing or in keeping us from doing all that we want to do are forces that we aren't in control of.
And that's why this kind of analysis would be good if it was every 5 years based on the current numbers going out 5 years, because anything beyond 5 years is just blue sky anyway. So if something like this, based on what you just said, because things are going to change, so every 5 years is that really this needs to be updated.
And I think we need to hear things like this, but I think I really, really, really want to see them in the context of the comp plan, because that's really where we will be making decisions off of.
And I think that tie-in is there through this process. It is a very macro approach and a macro look, and it is truly a snapshot in time. The tool that Denise and her team are working on that we talked about on Saturday, right? Like that's that next layer down where you can really start to see particular things. Like you can put a particular project or a particular initiative and really understand, does that deliver towards our goals? And then, there's other layers that you can do that you're even more refined. But this macro snapshot gives you an indication of working towards the map, working towards the comprehensive plan. Where are those most important things? And then the level of work from the Economic Development Department allows you to kind of see that pushing and pulling the levers in a much more refined way. So our hope is that we can make that pretty seamless for you, because this is the first snapshot, and then how do we kind of continue that conversation with a tool that delivers more, sort of by a year, or by 6 months, by an amount of time that seems more plausible.
Well, that's the value I see with this, is the comp plan needs, instead of waiting 40 years to update the doggone thing, do it every 5 years, this is updated as well.
Which is in the plan, yeah, that's part of the plan. But I think that's
a goal you've already stated.
Right.
Yeah.
The work we've done, right?
But I think that I would like, all of this is very good information, but it needs to take into account what the market is doing. I know you can't, but a lot of people can forecast, want to forecast, are wrong when they forecast, some of them get it right, I don't know about forecasting. But it's got to take into consideration what the market is doing, what the market is telling us. And it's got to take into consideration what's happening around us. Because we cannot ignore that, that is affecting us immensely. So, you know, we are, no, I'm not gonna get into detail there, but so I think that it's got to tie back into that stuff. Otherwise, it's just another bunch of numbers and a bunch of information that we can apply to our decision making Tuesday night or Monday night. It's got to be practical. Mark.
Just a completely different question. Has Tischler Weiss looked at our methodology for our impact fees? Sorry, this may not be a fair question. Have you seen that methodology?
No. Here. I don't think we actually looked at the methodology, we just had the bottom line numbers and I said to myself, I wonder what's going on.
It needs.
That too.
Yeah, I think just the council's recognized we need more work on that, and we've seen the comp plan and the TMP is kind of the place to kind of start that conversation again. So I think just acknowledging that, we need more work on that, so that's a way to maybe close some of that gap, but.
And I do want to recognize and kind of reiterate what you were saying, like this is absolutely at the macro level and no consideration of market or economic recession or otherwise, but it gives us a perspective and an understanding of one scenario versus the other. So it does help us at this level to say residential costs us a lot more money than commercial. For us, and then also the scenario of if we want to maximize our commercial opportunity, what we can do from a policy is, what does that mean? What are we willing to support from a density perspective? So it's really, it's not, you're right, it's not that individual piece, it's up here and it's at the comprehensive plan level and this map, because that's exactly what you used as assumptions. If we stayed at the current FAR, you'd get scenario 2. If you want to reach more, then you have to consider what does that mean as far as height and other things, but it's not gonna help our decision on a Tuesday. I agree with you there.
No, and to be quite frank, did we all not know this already? Did we not know that residential costs us money? Did we not know that if we put in commercial versus residential, that the bank account shifts? I mean, we know that, but it is the practical, how does that, apply the numbers to a big scary numbers, and all that. But I'm sorry, I just think of it in terms of the practical application to the decision making. And yeah, we need this background, we need this history, we need this information, but just to be blunt about it, I knew that residential costs us more. We know that. We cringe sometimes when we know we've got a huge residential rezone that wants to come in on commercial property. It's like, oh no. But we've got commercial property that has sat there for 50 years and not been able to sell. And the only people that want to buy it is somebody who wants to put a senior center there. So this is where I come back with the market decision making. So I'm going into a tangent.
Yeah, you are. I like this myself. This gives me a baseline. If things were to continue as is, this is probably what would likely happen, possibly happen. So I use it, I can see it as a very useful tool. Thank you.
Okay, next.
All right, Keith, you're up.
Okay.
Let me switch these slides out. Thank you, Julie.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Sure.
Hi, everybody. Good. Okay, so, bit of a good news, bad news there. Now, my turn.
You only have good news, right? Right?
Yeah, what was the good news? It's mostly good news. His whole presentation just changed. All right, so as a reminder, here we are, phase 4, talking about deciding what's possible and how we can prioritize getting to where we want to be. So with that, we went through the pathways to actions last time and covered the bottom of this list and kind of sort of on purpose left out the top of the list, which is capital investments. But let's talk about the elephant in the room here, capital investments. So again, we went through a needs assessment based on level of service. Again, very confusing about level of service and different uses of that term, but for us it's a lot of auto level of service, grading A through F, and then we came up with those other methods for the other modes for the level of service. So we went through our needs assessment and identified a long list of needs, and if you had a chance to flip through the implementation chapter over the weekend, you could see that it was 5 pages of projects. So let's kind of go through each of those. Auto and freight.
Can I ask a question first?
Sure.
It's about the weighting system. I'd like to get some clarification on the weighting system.
Okay, can I come back to that though? But, because I am going to talk about that in the presentation.
Okay, I just didn't want to get into the different projects and how, and the projects being weighted until I had the clarification on the actual weighting system that came up with those points.
Okay, let's talk about it right now.
Okay. I was looking at page 27.
Okay.
And there is a table.
Yep.
Project here, categories, and maximum possible score.
Right.
So I want to make sure I understand this correctly. If you're looking at the actives section, the bikes and peds, you have a maximum possible score of 150. So if you're looking at a project with that, you get that many points. If you're looking at the auto, it's 135. If you're looking at transit, it's 250.
Yeah, I see it. Here's a typo, and I have to apologize. I should have got this. The auto and transit have been flipped in this table. So it should be 250 for auto and 135 for transit.
Are the calculations right though?
Yes.
They are for right now.
Yes, they are. Robin, thank you for that.
It had me a little concerned.
I would be concerned as well.
Let's get
Because
clarity,
everything we
right,
heard
from the
was
outside.
traffic is the #1 concern.
Yeah, the sentence before is saying that the greater value is placed on auto, and I looked at that going, well, that's not what it says in the table.
You are exactly right. So that is a typo that I missed. Is that good? Is that good?
Looks like RTD paid you off.
So the sentence before that says that auto is our highest weight is accurate.
And now this would be accurate, but that's what I
Good catch, Robin.
I did have another question on the project prioritization on the previous page on 26.
Yep.
It's again the clarification. It's number 8. Achieve a balanced mode share. What does that mean?
Okay, so we talked about this a little bit at the last meeting, and from what we've discussed amongst this group is we don't know exactly what that means. It needs to be a priority for us moving forward to identify what that balanced mode share is. I think there's a little bit of back and forth here amongst this group about whether or not too many people are driving or too many people are taking transit or what we want our commute shares to be. So that is an objective that should be revisited as we revisit these plans and potentially made more specific. But I don't think we got to that point during this process to make that more specific.
So how will the points have been used for this in all the different mobilities if it is a moving target?
Great question. they've all been scored evenly.
But what was the balance
But
of
we've-
share used to do that?
Oh.
See, because if you're saying it's
No,
not
yeah,
decided, so
exactly.
that's
So the projects have all been scored evenly according to that objective.
So like they all got the same amount of points no matter what at this
Correct.
point?
Correct.
And that will be changing in the future potentially?
I think it probably should, as this deliberative body here decides what it would like to see the mode share to become.
And that may be something that your Transportation Mobility Board may look to tackle as they sort of become, you know, the next stewards of this plan.
So with that,
Go ahead, finish up.
So an awful lot of the transportation piece has nothing to do with people who live in Littleton.
That is definitely true.
Right, so, you know, what, I mean, an awful lot of our citizens, well, at least some of our citizens use light rail and they take the bus and so forth. But the line that comes up through Littleton from south and east, west, et cetera, is not our people.
Absolutely right.
So apart from getting out the cannons and so forth.
Robin, were you finished?
did have one little, so when you were using the point system for the balance mode, was that just like a 1 point, or how are they spread across?
Right, so each objective was scored from 0 to 5. So
right.
0 being the project has no impact on that objective, 5 being it has the best impact. So I believe, and I'll have to go back and check the spreadsheets, but I believe we scored each of those a 3.
Just kind of grab the middle as the indecision. Okay, thank you.
Carol? You good?
Okay, I have one question, just to clarify things. So the total cost column, where did those numbers all come from?
Total cost column.
Back where Robin was talking there, starting with, page 27.
It cost $2019.
Ah, yes. Those are planning level conceptual cost estimates developed by our team.
It was just a swag on what it would probably cost us.
We used basically unit costs for similar projects. Some of these projects don't necessarily fit into that unit cost projection. Something like Santa Fe and Bowles interchange is a pretty unique project. So we looked at some similar projects around the region and came up with a conceptual cost based on her.
So the 64 million for Broadway.
That would be a unit cost for, there's a range of what bus rapid transit could be. It's from anywhere from like 1 million a mile to like 25 million a mile.
So it was just giving us some sort of reasonable number to at least assume. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Carol?
Since we have the BRT there, how did we get to a place where we have something on this that hasn't had public discussion? We have a lot of citizens who have no idea what a BRT is, yet it's on our priority list. How did we get there?
Well, I have to say that it's been discussed by this group, it's been discussed in the CCC meetings. It's been discussed at various events.
That's not my question though.
Okay.
Didn't we have kind of a mission to have everything in here have public awareness to it? Did I miss something?
No, I think we did. This has been a public document and it's been shared. I think BRT has been part of our conversations. It's certainly been part of the
There's no doubt about
transportation plan.
that, yeah.
It's a public meeting. I don't think we're hiding it from anybody. Kathleen, what kind of input?
Right, so generally I think the disconnect is using the word, or using the letters BRT or bus rapid transit, but what we've heard from the community is an interest or a desire for higher frequency bus. And so looking at some of that routing, I think it's been surprising as the community's kind of looked at some of the maps that we've developed, what transit service does exist. I mean, we're in a unique position that we have some of the only north-south. What is unfortunately in the context of the regional system sort of frequent and reliable north-south service. and sort of frequent and reliable east-west service with the 66 that comes across Arapahoe. So what we've heard is that there is an interest in seeing that become more frequent and more reliable. So that's the conversation at the community level. What that would mean are potential of operating changes that would facilitate more frequent bus falls into that category of bus rapid transit. So we're pulling through that community conversation and desire with what might be an operational tool.
And I would just add to that too, that bus rapid transit has been identified on Broadway by RTD as well through several public processes. So it does have support at RTD's level and some support through those processes from the public as well.
I was just gonna say, I mean, I don't remember talking about a lot of these, but these just seem like all potential transportation projects that could be done in the next 20 years that would affect the system. Is that?
That is accurate.
So it wasn't, going through a list of anything that we discussed, I don't remember discussing the Peninsula Drive, Highline Canal, I mean, it's just all different options.
Yeah.
What I was going to ask is, I felt like we just jumped into the details, which I normally do. I wanna make sure my understanding of what we're looking at and what its purpose is, and I think we missed that. So can we kind of take a step back and say why this is here, how these lists came to be, before we jump into the detail?
And I will say that we're at this point in time, much like the fiscal impact, right, where we've had the discussion around goals and had the discussion around policy. So what you're looking at is if you were to move forward with the 5 goals in the transportation master plan and the set of policies, which are sort of indexed by mode, here's the list.
This is the list and here's what it would cost. Okay.
And how does
That's how I looked at this.
So how does our transportation board fit in all this? I mean, when do they play a role? Because they haven't been a part of this.
Well, they've spent some time with the plan, but the best analogy I can come with is that they are sort of in the blocks waiting for the baton, right? Like that they really, your role is in this first leg of this very long marathon, and their role becomes that next piece.
So like it or not, this is what they're gonna get to work with and go from.
And I think they need that policy and goal direction from you.
Okay.
To be able to help make recommendations and advise you on what those priorities would be. So creating that framework for them, and that's why we've talked about this transportation master plan being a framework, then becomes really an important piece. We had a great discussion last week. About the plan and just sort of how some of those goals and policy pieces, once those get solidified, what that would mean in terms of how you would go through a process of defining, like, what would you do first if there were money? Right, so that is that sort of tempered conversation and what they'll have to come back to you with. This becomes very much a living, breathing document.
You have 7 pages of projects. So
That's why
we haven't talked about 6.5 of them. So but what's good about it is we've never identified these either. So now they've been identified, whether or not they've been prioritized the right way, but they've been evaluated and they've got some sort of number applied to them. So we can have a better perspective.
This gives our board something to deal with or work with at this point.
I think, they got plenty.
Carol. Even with all of these 7 pages of projects, one that seems to be missing is the problem intersection that's a result of Littleton Village. And that's Dry Creek and Broadway. Is that not to be addressed anymore?
VP24, which is a shared use path.
What are you saying over there, Patrick?
Well, it's ID number BP20.
So if I may, make a suggestion.
Yep.
I definitely want this body to provide additional input on the project lists. Definitely. that's kind of like the whole purpose of this plan, is to make sure that we identify
That's
all
not
the necessary
it, Pat.
projects.
That's not it at all.
8014 on the last page, Broadway and Drive-Through Trail.
Keith was in the middle of saying something here.
And I wonder if it may be better to get all of those kinds of ideas via email.
Yeah,
That's
let's
not
go back
what
to
we
your.
Because I think that
Come
we,
here.
what's that?
Go ahead. Well, let's get back onto your
Okay.
agenda.
So, sorry, go ahead.
So I have a question about this. The grade separation at Bowles along Santa Fe.
Yep.
That seems to me that may wipe out downtown Littleton's charm and maybe even the revenue it generates. Because I'm trying to envision this, because we can't sink something because of the water table, so it's gonna have to be something up in the air.
That's Keith's problem.
That is CDOT's problem.
Santa Fe.
I think that that is one of the reasons that price tag on that particular project is so high. It is going to be a very complex intersection to figure out.
Well, it's not so much the complexity as the aesthetic impact
Right.
on where people right now seem to like to spend money.
Right. And so this is gonna be one of the key intersections that will be studied as part of the upcoming CDOT Planning and Environmental Linkages Study, which is gonna happen late this year, early next year, kickoff. It's a tricky spot, I have to admit. There are many different routes you could take with a solution there. But I think as Sterling Ranch comes online, as there's continued pressure from the rest of the region on that corridor, that particular intersection is going to have to be addressed, and it needs to be on our list, and we need to have some money identified as part of this plan and our local match to go towards that intersection, because it's a real problem. And you may have noticed that we've actually identified 2 projects at that location. One would be quote unquote interim, which is similar to what is being proposed at Santa Fe and Mineral, which is an alternative intersection design. I'm not here to say exactly what that's going to be. That's gonna have to be a separate study. The city's been spending a lot of time coming up with Santa Fe and Mineral options. Same thing at Santa Fe and Bowles probably. Something that can be implemented in the near term ahead of some future grid separation.
Which takes us to capital investments.
Which takes us straight to capital investments.
All right.
Okay, so on the auto and freight side, we did use the DRCOG model to project 2040 travel demand. DRCOG model it includes transit and it includes auto. It also includes bike and ped, but it's such a regional model that the bike and ped outputs don't really apply for a lot of the projects that we're talking about at this level. We also looked at high injury network locations, so locations in our system here where we have the most crashes that result in injuries. So we identified, I think there are 15 intersections that are on that high injury network. And then we wanted to propose projects that are consistent with our proposed street types and the map that we created together on the street types. So you can see we have 43 projects identified, spanning from widening of Santa Fe and County Line to intersection configuration projects to small projects that are adding medians or changing access types and that kind of thing.
Bruce? With respect to the widening, when you guys look at that and calc the numbers, I mean, how much of it is involving or what's needed from the standpoint of property acquisition at the margins? I mean, you're not gonna, on Santa Fe, for example, you're not gonna acquire property to the east because it's owned by the railroad.
Correct.
So how are you anticipating the engineering of that and the acquisition of property, or do we need property to widen it? Is there enough right of way involved that?
Generally, on Santa Fe, there's not enough property to widen, so you would need to acquire some. Particularly in the section between Mineral and Vinewood, basically that really tight section where the railroad is right there. So you would need to acquire property, and that's taken into account here.
So that, I mean, does that end up being the largest cost component as a result, hypothetically?
Almost, yeah.
Okay.
And again, we're trying to frame that around what it's a regionally significant project.
Correct.
And what our contribution to a
Which is,
regional project.
don't steal the thunder, that's my non-scary part.
Well, and, you know, I just wanna.
It's the non-scary part.
I wanna make a quick comment about what the conversation that just happened. I think we need to be very careful about talking about widening the streets, specifically Santa Fe. Because as Bruce just identified, those are people's homes, those are people's businesses. That is not part of our plan. That is not something that this city has ever said they're interested in doing. We are undertaking a massive project called the Pell, and it will be a long project and it will spend a lot of money and a lot of time in order to figure out how to move traffic on Santa Fe without doing that. So I mean, we need to make that very clear, because there's been fear-mongering in this community for 20 years about what's gonna happen there, and it has affected our economic development, it has affected people's quality of life. So I would like us not to talk about that in relationship to that, because that has never been an indication from this council or past councils that that was something that we were looking at. County Line has a plan. County Line has a plan for the widening. It's been approved. We've got money. We've got partnerships on that. And that is something that is in place at a level anyway, and that doesn't involve buying people's homes or businesses at this point. So I just just think that's important to say, so.
The fact that you said that's got people scared now.
No, I don't.
That'll do it.
No, I don't think it does, and I also don't think it's.
I totally agree with you,
I don't think it's.
I agree with you.
Karina?
I mean, I kind of come back to, I don't believe the purpose of tonight's meeting is to go by project, unless you want us to, but I heard you say, no, let's look at it from an email perspective. So, I mean, there's a lot we can talk about, but I wanna come back to, I see this as an implementation framework of possible, technically feasible projects to help us implement the transportation master plan and the capital investment to do them. That does not mean we're going to do all them. That does not mean we want to do all them. It just gives us a view of what it possibly could be. And that's kind of a question I'm putting at the end. Is that what we're trying to do here? Because I'm trying to figure out what my comments are gonna be.
Well, okay, so I think that Santa Fe, I don't wanna just move on from Santa Fe. I think Santa Fe is so important. Yep. And getting it right here amongst this body is worth our time.
We're doing a Santa Fe corridor study, and that's where we're gonna vet some of that out, and that's what the PEL is for. So I'm feeling a bit frustrated that we're getting into details where we haven't even looked. I mean, there's a lot of financial information here that we need to look at and understand what it's saying to us, because it's going to drive a financial decision for us. And I think like cart before the horse or something, or whatever the saying is.
Mayor,
I'm just not
if I may,
clear.
let's have Keith go through the presentation here. And let's make sure we get through the slides. Save your questions, write them down. But we gotta hear the point of this presentation here, so we can kind of wrap up and end here.
Okay, here we go. 400 million. Ooh. Okay, moving on. We'll come back to that number, I promise.
Is that the scary part?
one of the scary parts.
That's why I quickly
Yeah,
changed
okay,
the slide.
let's go on. Okay, so active transportation. Level of service, we identified level of traffic stress as the level of service component for active transportation. Again, we focused on high injury network locations. And again, we want to achieve designs that are consistent with our street types. 75 projects identified, 29 miles of bike lanes or paths. Currently, the city has, I think, right in that same number, give or take. So it would be a doubling of your bike facilities. 48 miles of sidewalk improvements. A lot of sidewalk improvements out there. 12 intersections, operation and safety improvements. So those are where we have identified crash locations where pedestrians and bikes are overrepresented in those crash statistics. And then 6 grade separated crossings. Those grade separated crossings are in locations where we have busier streets and there's not a safe route for people to cross. 46 million. Not too bad. Okay. Transit. Okay, so transit, where the city can really focus its attention is on speed and reliability for transit service. So we're talking queue jumps at specific locations. We're talking about maybe you have some exclusive lanes here and there, but we haven't identified many of those beyond Broadway because the transit service just isn't frequent enough to justify those transit lanes. And then we're talking about just access to transit. So first and final mile improvements, those kinds of things. Parking at Mineral, obviously a problem. A few different ways to solve that. One is LRT extension, one is parking garage. So those are both on the table as options. To get to Karina's point, it's an option. You probably wouldn't need to do both. But if one comes along, you're gonna want it in your plan as supporting that option. Bus rapid transit on Broadway, speed and reliability improvements on Littleton and on other downtown streets where transit operates. 232 million. 166 million of that is LRT extension. 37.
But it solves a lot of problems.
It solves a lot of problems for a lot of money. 37 million of that parking garage at Mineral. Okay, so not all of those projects are Littleton's problem necessarily, right? Well, it is Littleton's problem, but it's not Littleton's fault per se. So we went through the process to identify those regionally significant projects versus the local projects. So you end up with numbers that are about $95 million in local projects. And those are projects that probably the city's going to have to fund by itself. You may get some grants here or there, but it's going to be hard to compete for those. So that's where we're going to start to talk about funding that. Regionally significant projects, you are likely not going to be able to fund by yourself, and you're not going to want to fund by yourself. So we ran just really high-level concepts of how that could be achieved. One is if you are really successful in grant applications and other programs and getting money, and you have a really great team writing grant applications and that kind of thing, you're going to have maximum federal participation, which is laid out here. Transit projects versus active and auto. And those are just based on our experience at HDR and a few other firms that we've talked to and what we see cities are able to do. Moderate federal participation, something maybe a little more realistic. So I've personally written 5 grant applications for one project in Aurora. Unsuccessful, this is not going on my resume. But that's how it goes. Only about 5% of projects for a lot of these major programs are successful. And so it's a really hard thing to win grants. So we ran a moderate federal participation, and it really helps if you have a larger local match. You show those agencies that you're coming to the table with money, you're serious about the project and delivering the project. So there's our total needs, $678 million. based on the 95 million identified as local projects, plus the local match, here's where you're at with your City of Littleton funding needs. 188 million to 252 million, somewhere in that range. So, time to chase federal and regional dollars. Just a list of programs that are available. The implementation section has more detail. We will also be providing city staff a funding guidebook that provides even greater detail on each of those funding programs. I know the city is hired or is hiring a grant specialist, so that's a great step towards going for those.
Won't be you.
Probability that he's winning.
Get kicked too much doing that. So that's just a list of federal options. Here's a list of state options. You know, typically these state dollars are gonna go to the state highways in the city. So, you know, which is fortunate that that's where a lot of our issues are. But that's a limitation on some of the state dollars. Okay, so I had to get some numbers in front of you similar to Tischler advice just to keep up. But there's the 95 million in local projects, regionally significant projects, 580 million. The two scenarios where you have 152 or 252 million is that total for moderate scenario. Okay, potential sales tax. So if the city decides to go the route of a potential sales tax, now we've taken a view that there is no capital improvement budget. And so anything that will go towards that local match will need to be generated. So 0.25% sales tax through 1% sales tax. We have an annual estimate, this is in millions, so you would generate 2.8 million to 11.3 million in revenue based on that sales tax, given your existing tax base. So it doesn't take into account the Tischler-Bice projection, right? Yes, projection of potential new tax sources. If you just had a 1% sales tax, you would generate $11.3 million per year in revenue for a capital improvement budget. Now, if you did that, it would take 22 years on a pay-as-you-go basis to pay for your program. If you issued debt,
Sorry.
go ahead.
I'm gonna point out on page 13, there's different numbers. So 67 years, 33 years. Are we looking at the same information?
You may be looking at the other scenario.
Oh, this is scenario 2?
No, this is 3, he's looking at 2.
That's 2. Scenario 2. Are we looking at the same thing or no?
Scenario 2, moderate federal participation.
Oh, thank you.
At the bottom of the page. Okay.
Okay.
So that top scenario is if you're really successful, which is not out of the realm of possibility, but if you're really successful, you can pay these off quicker. If you do issue bonds, you basically reduce your purchasing power, but you front load all the work, right? So you'll be able to accomplish more within the next 5 to 10 years, but based on that 1% sales tax, you would only be able to pay for 58% of your program. So that's kind of how this table just lays out one concept of how this might work.
I don't know if I know what I'm asking, but you have this laid out. So suppose we didn't get started on this for 5 years.
Right.
How would that affect the cost? I mean, there has to be
Generally, costs are rising. So, and I should couch this to say that this is all 2019 dollars. So all of our cost estimates are based on 2019 cost estimates. All of this revenue is based on 2019 dollars. So if you waited, it would cost more.
Or if we took longer to finish once we do go, even if we started now, if we took longer.
Yep. That's assuming that construction costs continue to go up. Pretty fair assumption.
Pretty fair.
Okay, so other potential beyond sales taxes, you could increase your mill levy for transportation capital. Good example of this, Larimer County temporarily increased their mill levy for road and bridges to construct to help with the construction of additional lanes on North I-25 up towards Fort Collins. That will sunset at some point. So that's an option. Obviously, partnering with other local jurisdictions, the county, to form an RTA, which is a Regional Transportation Authority, to identify a suite of projects and then go for a tax to pay for those. Establishing local improvement districts, something like a business improvement district or something downtown is a good example. A lot of downtowns have those. And then metro districts as things come online, new developments come online. Even with all that, there still may be a shortfall, so we need to prioritize our projects, make sure that we have the right list moving forward. So just a quick summary of how we went about scoring these projects, all based on stakeholder, public, joint leadership feedback. Top 15 projects based on that scoring. Number 1, South Platte Parkway extension. You can see the list. You can see the costs. You see that Bowles and Mineral along Santa Fe are high up on the list as an example. So that's how we score the projects. Definitely welcome feedback on the weighting as we move forward. Since we've already done questions, I'll just show myself out.
Here we go. That works.
So you talked about, so one of the things that this document does do for us, it gives us various options to consider as a funding source. And we've talked at length about a sales tax, and you gave us some scenarios to consider on a sales tax and bonding. So one of the things I don't see here is, could we de-Bruce, and what does that look like? So wouldn't that be another funding source to consider? I'm not saying we're gonna do any of this, but it's just, if we're putting out there all the funding.
Yeah, really.
I can address that. Essentially, the city is not gonna have or be up against a Tabor issue since the fire is no longer part of the city. So de-Brucing really would not impact that.
Okay, so there's no incremental that de-Brucing would bring in, not in the near term or even in a future?
Unless our revenues were to increase substantially, meaning by probably 20 million a year or more, then no.
Which we don't foresee in 20 years.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Our baseline was set with fire, so.
And then the second question I have in this section here where you said max federal funding. So was that just assuming if we got some of these federal grants, does it also assume some state grants or anything else, or is this just federal grants?
Good question. It assumes essentially that you are successful in your pursuit of federal programs, many of which are passed through the state.
Okay, so all of it's in there?
Yes.
There should also be no de-Brucing of planning.
Okay, Bruce. I caught that.
You see what I did?
I did.
Once, twice, and then I asked our city manager if the typical maintenance that needs to be done in the city is covered by all the everything but the kitchen sink wish list here, and of course the answer is no. So the repaving, potholes, fixing sidewalks, curbs, gutters, all that good stuff is in addition to all this. So that is, and we are underfunded for achieving good streets.
I think I heard a number 30% underfunded.
Just second point you made a while back, you talked about Sterling Ranch coming online. I think you need to expand that and future ranches down that way. They're gonna, Douglas County, Smedley Ranch, whatever, there'll be more ranches. That'll put a lot more pressure on Santa Fe and C-470.
Yep.
So you should make note of that. It's
Definitely.
the end of ranches down there.
I agree, and I'll say that one key distinction here between the work that Tischler Weiss has done and the work that we've done is that Tischler Weiss and the comprehensive plan team in general are focused on growth within the city and how that affects the city, and we are taking a regional view and how that regional growth is affecting traffic congestion in the city. So that's a little bit of a discrepancy between the two analyses, and there's not necessarily a great way to address that discrepancy within the two models. So just a note.
Yeah, just a note.
And I think we've talked about the timing is really great because towards the end of this year, beginning of next year is when we start as a region looking at 2050 relative to MetroVision. So the best possible input into a regional plan are great local plans.
Real quick, Mark, to your point, we don't have enough money to take care of all the maintenance, but we do, because of the fire merger, we do have money every year, I think it's a total of 4.1 million in our budget to handle exactly that, the street maintenance. And we just saw a 5-year plan from the Public Works Department that shows how that money is going to be used in which neighborhoods, on which streets. Are they getting a full new street? Are they getting overlay? Those types of things. So it does apply that property tax situation we have with the fire department. It does apply that, and that's actually online now.
I don't think it's online yet, but.
We'll give you guys his.
I don't think it's on the money we have is how I put it, okay?
We have it for that.
But if we expand, so I guess my follow-up question to that is, if we expand exponentially, which is what this is, will that still be enough? And
Yeah, let me touch on these issues here. I think, yes, today, I think we should be very proud of what the council's been able to achieve in the capital plan with street maintenance. And so, yeah, 4.1, 4.3?
3.1.
Plus what?
Plus
what you
said, yeah.
Plus the 1.4.
Yeah,
So
that's
that's
annual.
1.5
All right.
annual.
Okay, 4 million plus. So, yeah, I think again, we should be very proud of what we've been able to achieve. So I think certainly in the foreseeable future, we do have a dedicated funding source now for street maintenance to a level that quite honestly, most of these would be very envious of. So, kudos to Public Works. They presented to the council here Saturday, kind of that plan for the next 5 years. I think the work that we're looking at here, the next 20 years, as we add capacity, add more lanes, then the maintenance issue starts to become diluted based on current funding. So that's kind of one issue. As we talked in the Saturday budget meeting, our capital fund has lots of issues. And so this is one piece of the equation, is transportation. As we talked, we got challenges in facilities, our fleet, all sorts of things tied up in capital. So the ultimate kind of funding pursuit here, the revenue piece of this thing, is much more complex than just transportation.
It's also worth mentioning though, that 3 million for the roads and streets, like Aberdeen Village is 2 miles. That's the whole budget, just that one little neighborhood. So it's not like every neighborhood can expect things to happen this year or next year. It's a 5-year plan. It's gonna take time.
That's right. Reconstruction in Aberdeen Village area is a good example where that's just extremely expensive. We gotta tear it out and put it back in brand new, very expensive.
And the planning to get there.
Right.
Is time consuming.
So I do think there's a gap here, because if we make a decision on our capital budget, we also have to make it, meaning for infrastructure, we also have to, and by default, we're making a decision on our maintenance budget. So I think there should be a factor in here, we call it an assumption, that says, with all of this infrastructure build will come an incremental need for X percent or whatever million for ongoing maintenance. So to make a decision on this, not having a view of what the ongoing maintenance is, will be not the complete picture, right? Because we can build it, but then if we can't maintain it, that creates a whole, then we're creating another problem for ourselves.
Definitely. And cities face that dilemma all the time. So, point well taken. Let me work with city staff and see exactly how we can incorporate that into the plan. That's it.
One of the things, and I'd like to see if you guys can integrate into this in terms of the fundings that you've got up there. There continues to be a lot of communication within the region about transportation funding options. The Metro Mayors has another plan that they're putting together that would help support funding for local projects. The state is working on another plan. The counties have got some things cooking. There's a couple of entities that have kind of self-created themselves to help come in and try to work on some of those. And so as long as there remains this looming transportation plan, there's going to have all these little entities. At some point, something's going to grab, something's going to have some traction, and it's going to change our numbers because we'll be part of that, hopefully, solution. So is there a way to leave that nimble enough that we can kind of roll those things through as they start rolling through? I mean, a lot of them are just infantile right now, but I think we at least maybe even need to get them on our radar so that we keep an eye on them, and then if something were to materialize.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that there has to be a conversation about what role in that advocacy this city wants to play. For whatever those funding mechanisms are. All of the conversations at the state, at the regional level, even at the county level, have all talked about a local share back, right? Like some contribution back to local communities. So that is an ongoing conversation as those become more and more relevant. But I do think there is a clear policy indication that you discussed relative to the transportation master plan in that transit piece, and maybe we go back and look at some of those policies to be a little bit clearer. That there was a clear indication of that advocacy with RTD about both the service level and the funding, and how Littleton gets represented in that regional piece. So if that's something that we can look at and bring back to you, maybe that matching that up and not just having that conversation in the transit, but in other ways too. I don't know, what do you?
I don't know we're saying the same thing, but I could go offline with you on it.
Okay.
Karina?
What I would also like to see on this, there's some of these projects that we've already committed to that are underway. And we've accounted for, we're already planning for some of that in our budget now. So I would like to look at this prioritization list to show where we, what's kind of our fiscally constrained projects now. So where's the line now? So that we have a clear understanding of what's the next, what's coming after the line that we're trying to solve for here from a funding mechanism. So I believe there is a line already somewhere that says we're already committed to or can handle one project. It may be just one, but I think it's important to identify that.
Other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mark, do you have anything else?
Thanks, Keith.
No, let's see, I'm looking to Kathleen, let's see, anything else we need to cover here this evening?
No, just a reminder about Thursday evening with Peter Caggiano, and hopefully you're able to join us for that.
Yeah, what was that, 5:45?
5 o'clock.
Was it 5 o'clock?
And then the event starts at 6 o'clock. There'll be a 30-minute reception with food and drink, and then the program will start at 6:30. And then I just want to make a reminder to you as you work with folks that you know here in the community, public comment does close on Monday at 5 p.m. So just that reminder.
How's that been going?
Yeah, it's we've gotten a fair amount of comments. Most of them have generated either by email or online through the online form that we have. We've had a few that have taken the survey tool to kind of go through chapter by chapter and sort of take a temperature read on each of those. So we'll get those put together in a way that it's helpful for you to see what kind of public comments we did receive. So, and we may get more, through the weekend, so. We expect to see more.
We come back, we meet again
On October 8th.
October 8th with the planning commission, right?
With the planning commission, so you'll be looking at those final documents.
And those are the final documents, and then the planning will they have those in a meeting? Will they
So they
pass that in?
So they meet on October 14th.
Okay, and then it comes to us on the 15th.
On the 15th, yes.
All right, very good. Thank you very much, Planning Commission. Appreciate you guys being here again.
And the goal we're working towards, just as a reminder, October 3rd is when you would be seeing this. You'll have some time before the 8th meeting, but we'll kind of run you through any substantive changes.
Perfect. Good job. Thank you very much. Thank you to our guests. Appreciate your work. Thank you.
Reed, do you have anything to